Spirit of God, we praise you for your faithfulness is assured. Though in your mystery we never quite know which way your wind will blow. We pray for your presence among us this day, that you would open our hearts anew to hear your word, and for the word spoken and heard today may not be mine, but yours. Amen. Well, I wonder what, if anything, Paul and his group were expecting. I wonder what they were actually expecting once they crossed over into Macedonia. Maybe, and this could be the honest truth, maybe it was nothing. Maybe they went there with zero expectations at all. Maybe they weren't expecting a thing about going over there. Maybe they had realized that their whole trajectory, everything that had brought them into Macedonia, into continental Europe, should have been a signal enough that they shouldn't go with any expectations whatsoever. After all, as those of you who were with us last week, you'll remember that they had first tried to go one way and God said no. And then they tried going another way. And again, God said no. But then it was only when Paul receives this vision of a man of Macedonia one night calling out, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." It was only when he received that vision that it led them to cross over, and it gave them this new direction. So maybe they would have learned to expect the unexpected, to go with the flow, to go as the Spirit leads, that sort of thing. Maybe that could have been on their minds. Or maybe once they had gotten that clarity, once they had gotten the vision of the man of Macedonia calling them, they had gotten the vision of where they were supposed to go, what direction they were supposed to head, maybe they thought, awesome, we have our bearings, now we can get back to doing what we do best. So they set off from Troas in northwestern modern-day Turkey. And after a couple of stops, they make their way to one of the leading cities in the area, a city called Philippi. If you've ever heard of the book of Philippians, of Paul's letter to the Philippians, same place, writing to the church in Philippi, writing to the church that would emerge later in this city. And so they get there, and just from some of the signals in the text, we can tell that there is something different about this place. We noted last week that crossing over into Macedonia meant going into something else. I mean, yes, everything is fluid in one region, different from another, but something was different here. Sure, there were some common threads going through. Much of the ancient world that they lived in was heavily influenced by the Greeks and then the Romans, but this was different. And the city of Philippi kind of represented that. For one, here's a bit of a history lesson. The city of Philippi was founded by Alexander the Great's father, Philip, and so its roots are far more Macedonian, far more Hellenized than anything that they had encountered before. And plus, this particular city had been made into a Roman colony. Now, you might have heard that in the text and wondered, well, what does that mean? It meant that the Romans had specified this city. They had a few of these throughout the empire. They had identified this particular city and reorganized it into being something like a mini Rome, a miniature Rome. And so the whole place was reconfigured and reorganized about 70 years prior into being a miniature Rome. And the way that we can tell that this is different, the way that we can tell that this spells out into a very different context for ministry and mission for them was in the way that they go about their evangelism in the city. Something was different. If you were to take a close look at the methods that Paul used throughout his missionary journeys, his most common process, what he did more often than not, whenever he would go on his missionary journeys and he would come to a new city, a city where there was not a church before, a city that had not been encountered by the gospel before, what he would do when he first got to the city was not to go to, say, the central plaza or to the city market, some kind of public place like that. He wouldn't do that. Instead, where he would go most often was to the local synagogue. And when he spoke publicly in this local synagogue, he wasn't speaking predominantly to a Gentile audience. He was speaking to those that were there at the synagogue, that is, the Jews that were in that city. Now, there is some irony in that, because some of you might be thinking, now hold on, preacher, Haven't you been saying this whole time for the past 5 weeks, haven't you been saying that Paul's been pounding the table about how important it was that the church be reaching out to the Gentiles, that the church include those whom God had been drawing in by the Spirit into the church, those that God had been drawing in from outside the covenant people of Israel? Isn't that what Paul has been saying this whole time? So yeah, there's some irony here that Paul has been going to synagogues in each city while at the same time he's been emphasizing so much the ministry to and for the Gentiles. But did they do that here? Did they go to a synagogue here? Well, no. Why didn't they? Well, simple enough. Because it looks like there wasn't one. Nearly everywhere else that Paul and his group went seemed to have a synagogue there. That is, that there was a sizable enough Jewish community in that particular city in order to support one. But here Luke tells us that they were there for some days, but not that they went to a synagogue. Instead, what do? They got to come up with something else. Instead, presumably after they go into the city and they discover that there is no such place as a synagogue in the city of Philippi, they head out for what they guess is a place of prayer, somewhere outside the city, somewhere along the river, an informal gathering place for worship. And so they go there and they speak with the women who had gathered there. And there they meet a woman named Lydia, someone who is described as a worshiper of God. Now that phrase there, when you heard that, you thought, well, what on earth does that mean? What does that specify? That phrase, worshiper of God, to describe this woman, Lydia, it probably notes that she was a Gentile sympathizer with the Jewish faith, recognizing one only God. And she wasn't from there. She actually wasn't from Philippi. She was actually from somewhere else, actually back in Asia Minor, but it seemed that this was home base for her. Some other things to know about this woman, Lydia. She was a businesswoman specializing in selling purple cloth, which was a luxury item. So it meant at the very least that either she was well off or at least many of her customers were. And as she was there outside the city by the river at this place of prayer, she listens to what these men who had come from across the water were saying. And it said, the Lord opened her heart. Did you hear that phrase there? It's a powerful phrase. The Lord opened her heart. And then by her leadership, her whole household was baptized. And by the way, a bit of a side note here, if you have ever been curious as to why we baptize babies in the Presbyterian Church, as we did at the early service outside earlier today, that is why we baptize those who have no idea what is going on. This passage is among the reasons that we do so. The faith of the head of the household of a parent leading to the claiming of God's promises upon those who are under that same blessing. If you've ever wanted to know more about that sort of thing, let's talk. It's a fascinating thing. But blink and you'll miss it as we read through this passage in Acts. Blink and you'll miss it. And what we have just been told about is the first convert to faith in Europe. The first disciple of Jesus in Europe. And suffice it to say, this was not on Paul's bingo card. This was nowhere near a circumstance that Paul was expecting. Think about it from Paul's perspective. Think about what he may have been expecting going into Philippi. He sees a vision to cross over into Macedonia, and more specifically, he sees a vision with a man of Macedonia calling him to cross over. And then they go over, they hop around, and they land in a city that they think would be a good base of operations. They settle in, but then they discover that there's no synagogue, which means that their whole playbook, everything that they were used to doing, that they had seen effective time and time again, that whole playbook, that's out of the window now. Their usual method for evangelism is not available to them now. So instead they go outside the city because they hear that there's this informal gathering place of prayer and of worship. And instead of any men of Macedonia, which Paul might have been expecting just from the vision that he had received, instead of any men of Macedonia, they find a gathering of women there. And then as they're talking with this group, the one person who actually responds is a woman who isn't even from there to begin with, but instead, ironically, is from back where they all came from. The point is, someone like Lydia isn't who Paul was expecting. And I think that is a beautiful thing, especially at this point in the spread of the gospel, especially at this point in the story of the church. Because right out of the gates in this new crossing, this new frontier for the gospel, do we find Paul hitting his stride and honing his craft as an evangelist and maybe brushing up on his talking points that he could bring from one synagogue to the next? I'm sure he's doing that. I'm sure he's improving with every given day. It just didn't happen here. The setting, the audience, you name it, none of it is what Paul could have planned for. And so what the book of Acts seems to be telling us over and over is that it's not Paul who's really doing the work. What does it say? The Lord opened her heart. And what an impact just from those few words. The Lord opened her heart. I mean, think of the immediate impact here. As Paul continues his ministry there in that city, there in Philippi, he gets into some trouble. We'll find out more about this next week. He gets into some trouble. And where is the place of safety when Paul gets into some trouble? Where's home base in what would become a hostile city? Lydia's house. Or later on, when Paul writes back to this church, when Paul writes back to the church that emerges in this city, it's a word of joy, giving thanks for the faithfulness and the humility of this congregation, for the love of this church. And where does this church start meeting? Lydia's house. Or even more broadly than that, the gospel spreading into continental Europe, that first affirmation that God was indeed going to be at work through Paul in this new mission, this new frontier for the gospel, that Paul and his group hadn't severely misread that vision that Paul had to cross over. The first sign that they were on the right track, what is that first sign? Lydia. What unexpected, glorious blessings have come because the Lord opened the heart of this woman. And a question I would invite you to ask yourselves today is, who is your Lydia? Who's been the one whose impact and faith in your life is simply impossible to quantify? Some of you may remember that for me, the two greatest influences on faith for me are two women, my mother and my grandmother. My mother in raising me in the faith, and my grandmother, my paternal grandmother as it happened, who was a Methodist minister herself, modeling in real time what a life in ministry can look like. Those are some Lydias. I just might know of one more. I live with one, shaping the faith of our kids. Who is your Lydia? And not just who's your Lydia, not just who has been the one who God used to open your heart, but who might you be a Lydia for? For whom could you be the one that they look back on and remember, wow, this whole faith thing, it started with you. I can't imagine what life and faith would look like now if you hadn't been in my life. Who might you be a Lydia for? You might be a Lydia through the expected things. After all, it's not like Paul was doing something wrong going to the synagogue in each city. The things he was used to doing, the tried and true methods, those were expected. Those are good things. It could be through things, if you are seeking to be a Lydia for somebody else, it could be through things that you might imagine would have an impact. Some of the expected things that could have an impact. The evening prayers as a parent, the blessings at the table, reading the Bible together, being a Sunday school teacher, leading within the youth ministry, joining in service and in fellowship, you name it, all of those things, those are expected things. Those are beautiful things. They're good things, tried and true. But like Paul going out to the place of prayer outside the city, it could be through the unexpected things. that God uses you too to open someone's heart to the gospel. We've been talking a lot about this campaign, obviously, the past 5 weeks, about the impact of building updates and the impact of our partnership at Olive Tree Early Learning Academy. And on one hand, yes, there are expected and hoped for ways that updates to our building can foster greater fellowship and greater connection. And there are expected and hoped for ways that support and relationship with our ministry, like Olive Tree, can directly impact children and their families, especially the households led by single mothers. There are expected and hopeful ways that we might see an impact there. But you want to know what I'm excited about too? All of the unexpected ways. All the ways that we can't possibly begin to think about now. Because as a church, we can do all the things that might be part of tried and true methods. And those are good things. We can and should do those. We can be faithful to them. But as we saw with Paul and with Silas and with Timothy and with Luke in the city of Philippi, it's not just a matter of rolling out the playbook, take it to a new city, take it to a new ministry, and let things roll out. As we see with Lydia, ultimately it's the Lord who opens the heart. My grandmother, my dad's mom, Nana, as I called her, as I shared a minute ago, she was herself a Methodist minister, and she went to divinity school after her kids had grown. But faith was, of course, a big part of what she hoped to cultivate in her home. As sometimes happens, though, the seeds of faith don't always grow in the timing that we might hope for. And long story short, for 2 of her 3 kids, the notion of faith and Jesus and the church just didn't emerge as a major part of their lives. And her youngest, my uncle, had been one of the 2. The other was my father, in fact. But her youngest, my uncle, had been one of the 2 for whom faith really was more of a suggestion. His life somewhat reflected that. It wasn't antagonistic or anything. It was just kind of amorphous. Not committed, not having a strong claim upon his life. And as I got older and I was starting to discern my own call into ministry, and as she and I started talking about that, she shared her own regret. She shared the regret that she had. Not regret at herself necessarily, just regret that for one reason or another, faith had not taken root for him. Despite all that she had done as he was growing up, all that she had tried to do throughout her life to cultivate faith within her son's life. Years later, my uncle got sick, and Nana endured every parent's fear. This would have been about 13 years ago when he died, and it was in his last few weeks, as can sometimes happen when communication and function can become difficult. And I remember one evening in the hospital room, I was there with my uncle and with Nana. It was mostly quiet more than anything else besides the machines beeping and booping around. By that point, it was tough for my uncle to really say much of anything, but then I remember my grandmother beginning to sing. She had a beautiful voice. I remember she began to sing a few familiar hymns. Hymns she grew up with, hymns that her children had grown up with, just something to fill the air and maybe give her dying son a bit of comfort. And then piercing through the fog of illness, my uncle surprised us both by joining in, singing along. Now, I can't claim that a soul was saved that evening. Nothing like that. I can't claim to know what work the Lord may or may not have done in my uncle that night. I just know that something was opened, something that neither I nor my grandmother was expecting. So may we look for the Lydias, and may we look to be Lydias, never knowing what our efforts may bring about in the Lord. In the name of the Father,